Conclude, and I want to thank you all for your patience today, although it is a much more present day than it has been for quite some time. So our next speaker is Diana Peasey of the NUJ, now has kind of given up some of her posts in preparation for retirement, but has been involved in the Trades Council for many years, and a stalwart for trade union rights for journalists across the world, especially where they are facing dangerous circumstances, such as in Palestine and Ukraine right now. Diana Peasey.
I've been a working journalist all my life, and the current times actually I find depressing. 5 years ago I spoke at the MayDay rally about the death of Lyra McKee, the Irish journalist who was shot dead while observing a riot in Derry. I spoke then about the deaths of other journalists who were killed while doing their job, reporting on key political issues, investigating corruption and covering conflicts across the globe. Today it is important to stress once again that journalists are still being targeted while covering events, whether it's in Gaza, the Ukraine.
Sound system's really good. Would you speak really slow? Sound system. Put it up to your mouth. Sorry.
I apologise for that. As I said, I've been a working journalist, and the difficulties we are having of journalists covering the events in Gaza, the Ukraine, the Philippines, Kashmir and other countries. As journalists, they're providing us with an insight into what is going on in those countries. Their reports are essential for us to understand the various conflicts and the rationale, often a snapshot of brutality. Media groups and trade union organisations, including Reporters Without Borders, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, the International Federation of Journalists, the National Union of Journalists, and other Palestinian journalist groups have been logging the deaths, the abductions, and the arrests of journalists. Increasingly, what we are seeing are journalists arrested and detained in prison around the globe. According to the International Federation of Journalists, 80 journalists were jailed last year in China and Hong Kong, and this was followed by 54 in Myanmar, 41 in Turkey, 40 in Russia and the Russian-occupied Crimea, 35 in Belarus and 23 in Egypt. Sadly, an average of 80 journalists die each year while working and doing their jobs. And between 2003 and 2022, before the start of the Gaza conflict, 1,668 journalists had been killed. Not surprisingly, the past year alone has seen many more journalists lose their lives in conflicts and political clampdowns. According to several journalist organisations, at least 122 journalists have been killed since the start of the conflict in Gaza on October the 7th. Most of them were Palestinian. 77 journalists were killed in the first 10 weeks of the conflict, far more than the 63 journalists who died in the entire Vietnam War in the 1970s. Israel has been one of the most bloodiest and deadliest of recent conflicts, particularly for journalists. Elsewhere, 13 journalists have died in Mexico, 3 of them for reporting on political unrest and crime issues, while in Ukraine 3 have died, and there have been deaths in Afghanistan, the Philippines, India and China, plus those in South America and South Africa and Africa. It's not surprising that news organisations are closely monitoring the deaths of journalists and media workers. The Committee for the Protection of Journalists says the Israeli Defense Forces cannot guarantee the safety of journalists operating in the Gaza Strip after they had sought assurances that their journalists would not be targeted by Israeli strikes, and they were Reuters and the France Press News Agency. Journalists in Gaza face particularly high risks as they try to cover the conflict during the Israeli ground assault, including devastating Israeli airstrikes, disrupted communications, supply shortages, and extensive power outages. Who knows what will happen when the Israelis enter Rafah? As of April the 30th, the CPJ states 97 journalists and media workers were confirmed dead, and that varies across organizations. 92 Palestinian, 2 Israeli, and 3 Lebanese. 16 journalists were reported injured, 4 journalists were reported missing, 25 journalists were reported arrested. The CPJ is also investigating numerous unconfirmed reports of other journalists being killed, missing, detained, hurt or threatened or damaged to media offices and journalists' homes. The Programme Director of CPJ, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, Carlos Martinez de la Serna, says since the Israeli-Gaza war began, journalists have been paying the highest price, their lives, to defend our right to the truth. Each time a journalist dies or is injured, we lose a fragment of that truth. Journalists are civilians who are protected by international humanitarian law in times of conflict. Those responsible for their deaths face dual trials, one under international law and another before history's unforgiving gaze. Just coming up, there's wide concern about the fate of journalists covering conflicts. Foreign journalists are not allowed in Gaza. Sorry about this. Unless they are embedded with Israeli forces. For the Palestinian journalists inside Gaza, there is no protection. Sadly, their clothing with the sign "Press" offers no protection. The high number of deaths amongst journalists in Gaza enforces the statement of the Committee for the Protection of Journalists that the Israeli forces don't want the truth to come out. Sadly, truth is another casualty in this war. Thanks a lot indeed.
Thanks, Diana, and for all your work in the NUJ and in the trade union movement over such a long time and standing up for persecuted journalists across the world.